All right. So you think about selling on Amazon's international marketplaces, or you currently are selling on Amazon's international marketplaces, and you're thinking to yourself, this sounds like a great opportunity, but there's got to be a catch. And so I am Kevin from Maximizing E-commerce. I help people build global e-commerce businesses. I have services where I help people with this. And, here's the thing. Take everything everyone tells you in this business with a grain of salt. Take what I'm telling you with a grain of salt, because yes, I do have services where I help people go into international marketplaces, but I don't want to sugarcoat it and make it just seem like it's so simple. So recently I was on a panel at the Prosper Show, which is the largest um, conference for Amazon sellers. And on the panel, we were talking about how um, basically it's not as plug and play as they make it sound. And I'll get into that. So I've got a few components here of what I think are the truth, but I want to end with some good news for you. So we'll keep it on a high note. So stick around to the end. So the reality is it's harder than it looks. And sometimes people think it's like way hard and they just don't do it at all because they're too scared of it, which we'll get into that here in a moment. But sometimes Amazon will make it sound easier. Like you just go there and you click buttons. I think that's their intent, but it never quite works out. And so, um, and again, maybe it's just the people that end up coming to me in my services are folks who have had issues. And so they're just like, I need someone to help me with this, please. And so maybe I just end up with a lot of accounts where there are issues, but they seem to be pretty common and people come to me with the issues. So I know they're not just one-off people. In fact, one time I had a client say to me, "Am I your problem child?" I'm like, "Oh, you have no idea. Everyone seems to have some sort of issues, whether it's the catalog issues, you add a product and Amazon says like, oh, we got to check with the brand owner. It's like, well, but I am the brand owner and I'm brand registered. And that doesn't seem to make sense. I'm like, but it's your system. You can see right here. So just some of the random stuff. One time I had a client who actually had to provide a letter that they were authorized as a seller for their own brand. It's like, why? So it can be harder than it sounds. Again, it's not as plug and play, especially with adding listings. And then sometimes too, when you're, registering for, which we'll get into here in the next bullet point, and that is compliance. Sometimes the issue is that you'll have, um, you know, a list of requirements of documents, whether from Amazon to set up the account for the KYC, know your customer laws, which are required pretty much internationally for financial transactions, which you understand. They want to make sure that the money goes to who it's supposed to go to, which really is for your protection. But with that, sometimes in the registration, either for the Amazon's KYC payment laws or payment compliance, or for, let's say, getting a VAT number or some other registration, sometimes it's harder than it sounds. Like if you go to, let's say, the Florida Department of Revenue and you say, I want a tax ID, you can have it in a matter of minutes. Like it's that way in a lot of places. Or Canada, you just say, here's my form. And then 4 to 6 weeks later, they say, here's your number. It's just a manual process. You go to Europe and it's like they'll argue with you because you didn't sign something in blue ink, or, the that's not the type of invoice we want. And it's like it becomes this kind of back and forth about minutia that no one even really knows what the real right answer is. And so sometimes compliance can be very muddy. Now, with that, it can be frustrating, but eventually, as long as you got someone reliable to help you out, especially like I use Avask, for example, um, to do compliance, especially for VAT. Um, you want to have someone reliable that can at least speak the language and push back a little bit, because sometimes they just go to whomever is working that day. Let's say at HMRC, which is like the IRS of the UK, and say, okay, here's the documents for this company. And then they come back and say, no, that's the wrong document. But it's like, well, the person before just told me this was the right document, and that's why we submitted it. And it's like, you got to have somebody at least understands the context of it, because it can almost be like, have you ever heard of the analogy of if you go to a fish and you say, what's the water like? And they say, what's water? Because they're just in it. And so sometimes, especially if you're American or Canadian or Australian, uh, it can be hard trying to understand European ways of doing things, especially when you're looking to expand into Europe. So it is helpful to have someone to walk you through the compliance. Now, the challenge with some of that too is on the flip side. Well, let me take a step back before I go into my next point. So, one year, this was pre Wayfair. So, you probably, if you've been selling for a while or you're just familiar, there was the Wayfair versus South Dakota or South Dakota versus Wayfair, one of the two, a Supreme Court case that had a big impact on sales tax. And I wouldn't say it's still like, it's like, totally figured out right now, but it's a lot more black and white in a lot of cases than it was before. And there was a lot of gray area. Um, and I had visited an attorney, a tax attorney. I was like, I just want somebody to go over this because there was a lot of advice out there that was saying, do this or register for that or whatever the case was. And so I went to a um, tax attorney and, you know, let's say a couple months go by. My birthday and Christmas are around the same time. And I had a birthday card and a Christmas card from from this attorney. And, just the envelope just says, the law offices of, so and so Esquire or whatever. And my wife is like, why are you getting these letters from an attorney? I'm like, oh, it's a birthday card, Christmas card. The reason was because every time I talked to him, it was the equivalent of a tax or a tax payment. It was almost the equivalent of a tax payment. It was almost the equivalent of a car payment. And so it was expensive. Now, his advice was take with a grain of salt what anyone tells you on the compliance uh, world, because especially if they have a vested interest in you doing more filings, more registrations. This was his advice. Now, granted, don't take that to mean anything. That was just his advice. And so I've taken that lens to think, okay, you know, there's a good chance the person I'm talking to is correct, or the good chances they're correct, but maybe not quite so much. And so, it, and the funny thing was, as I mentioned, I was paying him basically a car payment for an hour of his time. Um, and all of the advice was pre-qualified with um, words like you may consider or possibly or you might want to. Nothing said do this, don't do that. Nothing was black and white. Everything was, well, there was good explanations and he did a good job with that, but everything was this kind of like mucky dancing around what the correct answer is. And so, and this was an attorney, like, and he specializes in this stuff. So one of the lessons that also taught me, which I try to impart to other people, is at the end of the day, the only person that's responsible for your compliance is you. And so, yeah, you want to make sure you understand the risks and whatnot. And I tend to be the type that plays it safe more often than not, especially if there's a gray area. So understand if someone says you need to do this, ask why and just ask for context. If their answer is, well, for compliance purposes, dig a little deeper and find out why. That's really all I would have to say. So if someone says you need to do whatever because Amazon might ask for it. Well, did Amazon ask for it? Some sort of registration, or are you registering your business as a pesticide and you sell dry erase marker erasers? I don't know. I just made that one off the top of my head. So that might be an extreme example, but sometimes you run into those weird things, especially internationally, where you might not know the laws of the country you're going into, but whereas if it was in the US, you might go back and say, this is not pesticide. Think about that when you go into the other marketplaces. But on that note, if you have anything that makes any sort of health claims or is ingestible, whether by humans or pets, you might have more compliance than you have in the US. Anything that's electrical, anything that's topical on the skin, just things like that. Just you might have a higher level of compliance, but just ask the question and make sure you're comfortable with the response is really more my answer, my point there. So I'm not saying don't be compliant. I would highly recommend you do compliance, but I would do your due diligence and maybe sometimes ask around to make sure. There was a commercial a few years ago of, I think it was Allstate for like or Farmers or one of those insurance companies, and it was like, you might have this, and it's showing like, a family sedan, but you're insured for this, and it's a Lamborghini. And so you might just want to make sure as are you building Lamborghini compliance, but you have a family sedan, or are you overdoing it, maybe so to speak? And the problem is there's no black and white answer, especially when you're talking about other countries, because you might not quite understand how things go there. So just sometimes it's good to talk around and just get what's the word I'm looking for, just get feedback from other people that are doing it. Ask other sellers, especially if you know people that sell similar products to yours. Now, granted, they're not responsible for your compliance, you solely are, but it can give you context to make a better decision. Hopefully that makes sense. And then there's just the unknown, and that scares a lot of people away from international. And a lot of times people say like, I just don't want to do it. Like there's just too much stuff. It's going to be all this stuff to set up. But the nice thing is once you get on the other side, and this now gets to the good news, is that generally speaking, selling in international marketplaces, especially certain ones like Canada, UK, Germany, almost all the time will knock the pants off of some other marketplaces that let's say non-Amazon places like Shopify or Walmart. Your sales in Canada, I've only met one person who ever said that their sales on Walmart beat their Canadian sales. And I've been saying that for months now. Granted, eventually someone's going to say, well, that's not 100% true. In my case, well, that's the case. Leave a comment down below. But for now, almost without fail, sellers will do better in Amazon Canada than they will in Walmart. And sometimes we want to go chasing after some of these off Amazon platforms because we think we're going to get better sales there, or it's going to be a better experience. But again, more often than not, Amazon International is your best option. And so the nice thing is, because it can be a little bit scary, kind of creates a moat. And so you generally end up with less competition. As long as there's not no competition, like there might be in some marketplaces, like in some of the newer ones like UAE or Singapore. There's just not a lot of people there, and there's not enough opportunity. But if there's enough competition, but not as much as there is in the US, that can be a good thing. That's why I think a lot of people end up selling in Canada and get like maybe 10-20% of their US sales going into Canada for a similar size catalog. Now, granted, none of that's guaranteed, but oftentimes they get that even though the population is around 10%. Sometimes they're more higher sales relative to the population just because there's less competition on Amazon. So it's definitely Amazon in the US, I should say. So it's definitely worth considering selling internationally. I don't want to paint the picture that it's so easy to do or it's just plug and play like some folks do. But I do want to make it realistic. But the good news is, once you're on the other side, it's generally pretty straightforward. So if you have any concerns and you need help along the way, down below, you can apply to work with myself and my team. If that is something that would be helpful for you, feel free to apply to see if working with my team and I to help you in your international expansion would be beneficial for you. So wishing you the best in your e-commerce journey, and take care.